By 5:30 a.m., savage combat was still going on throughout the battlefield, although many critical instances of fighting had now come to their conclusion throughout the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma metro area. There were still areas within the city where fighting was still relatively heavy, including the fighting in the entertainment district between the remains of the 2nd of the 134th Infantry Regiment itself, an airborne infantry battalion of the Oklahoma National Guard of the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, as well as in the downtown area, as increasingly the remains of what was even left of the personnel of the 1st of the 160th Artillery Battalion, along with some alphabet paramilitary forces and armed reactionary civilians in small numbers, had been increasingly squeezed by half of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion sent in from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade to conduct the flank clearing operations in the south-central portions of the metro area before encountering and encircling gradually the 2nd of the 134th, while the other half of the battalion had crossed, with its other 4 companies aiding the Special Operations troops airlifted in from the 58th Special Operations Battalion, as they had conducted their high-value individual capture operations before assisting in creating the cordon around these forces. As in the east of the Eastern Pocket, many battalions coming from the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, 118th Combined Arms Brigade, and also the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade, as its forces that had captured the Tinker Air Base early on in the campaign had since moved up to assist in surrounding this eastern pocket that developed, along with a few companies of the Special Operations Battalion that had been flown in on the capture operation of high-value targets of the state regime, as they had captured its military leadership from its National Guard branches, Air and Army, as well as its local political individuals. As this fighting now still continuously raged on, and the fighting with the remains of the 2nd of the 134th was relatively coming to its end, the forces of the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, or essentially a special troops battalion, along with some reactionary armed civilians that had moved into the area, similar to what had occurred with the 1st of the 279th within the kill box that had been created by the same battalions that had surrounded and destroyed the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion and its headquarters of headquarters company over the entire 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which had been carried out by a Mechanized Infantry Battalion and the Armored Battalion from the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, as well as the Mechanized Infantry Battalion sent in from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade to assist the Mechanized Infantry from the 93rd in surrounding and destroying the reactionary armed civilian pocket of 750 armed civilians that had attempted very early on and failed to establish a refugee camp for the fleeing civilians from the emerging Trojan shock forces, as they had come out of their CCP regime properties and the artillery barrage had kicked off at 12:30 a.m. As the Armed Recon Helo Battalion and the Attack Helo Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment had participated in this action against these armed civilians in a kill box, and a kill box that had rapidly decimated the 1st of the 279th Infantry Regiment, which was a Mechanized Infantry Battalion in this particular kill box at the sewage and water treatment facility. The Helo elements had since moved off-map and begun flying aviation patrols to the east of the city in preparation for the 58th to emerge from their victory soon to be achieved in Oklahoma City to advance on Tulsa and capture it, as they would be relieved in short order by the arriving 10th PLA Group Army from the external prong of Group Armies 7 through 13, dropping the 10th off in the city to relieve the 58th to conduct further operations slightly to the north and east against Tulsa. as these same 3 battalions, the Mechanized Infantry from the 93rd and the Mechanized Infantry from the 53rd, along with the Armored Battalion of the 93rd, having destroyed these forces, and the headquarters of Headquarters Company left stranded after cruise missile strikes on their motor pool, these forces prepared to move north after a swift, rapid refueling and replenishing of their ammunition stocks, as logistical resupply had been occurring within the 45 minutes prior to the battle that was to break out with the 1st Squadron of the 180th Cav Regiment, itself a reconnaissance and target acquisition battalion comprised of 4 total companies, its headquarters company, and 3 companies of essentially what was Cav Scouts. This force was equipped with infantry fighting vehicles, armor personnel carriers, the infantry fighting vehicles being, of course, the Bradley, the armor personnel carriers being the M113s, the support vehicles being the standard LMTV trucks, and the fuel trucks and the M88 armored recovery vehicles, in addition to Max Pro MRAPs that were part of the headquarters elements, as well as serving as security vehicles for said elements. These forces had already been pinpointed insofar as their location by the PLA. However, the decision had been taken by the 58th PLA Group Army's command elements within the headquarters battalion, its independent HQ battalion, to hold off on attacking these forces until the other objectives of the 45th Infantry Brigade combat team in the eastern parts of the city had been accomplished first, as control of the highways and the fall of the Tinker Air Force Base within this sector was of the utmost priority. And now that these forces that had once been guarding these sewage and water treatment facilities, as well as being adjacent to major highways, especially the Tinker Air Force Base, had now fallen. And these forces, after having heard of the nearby combat occurring, had since begun to move their vehicles out of their once hidden locations being inside of warehouse buildings that had been requisitioned by the state and federal regimes and thereby leased for their use temporarily as a bivouac location for this unit before they would be sent to their duty assignment as far as what they were to protect insofar as critical infrastructure. They would now be targeted by tactical ballistic missiles as well as cruise missiles, as once again, due to the cruise missiles being fired in different salvos at different times, the targeting data could be updated or changed on these different container-based systems, and it indeed would be now that this unit was manifesting itself as the PLA forces not only had wanted to focus on eliminating other threats first before engaging this unit, but because this unit was in hiding within its warehouse facilities, it had wanted to wait until the unit emerged just for confirmation by the ISR assets, such as the satellite-based ISR assets, the WZ-8 high-altitude stealth recon assets, and increasingly within the local area, now that these units had defeated the 545th and the HHC, the quadcopter, squad, platoon, and company level reconnaissance assets at the local smallest levels. These forces, these ISR forces and assets and drones, mapping out the battlefield in real time, and as these forces had been discovered, the J-11 fighter jets, just as they were preparing to leave the battle space due to fuel considerations, they would partake in this particular battle as a pair of J-11 fighters would drop their only air-to-ground munitions, as they were primarily by this point in the fight still armed with predominantly air-to-air munitions, albeit with a few exceptions, such as the few 500-pound air-to-ground laser-guided munitions, which they had carried, as the other J-11s had, for the most part, already used up their air-to-ground munitions and also partaken in strafing attacks. There were 2 left that hadn't, as of yet, dropped their air-to-ground munitions and would thus do so in this battle before departing on their RTB back to Mexico, as they had just gotten fuel before the fuelers had to do their own RTB back to Mexico to refuel at the air bases, as well as reload their fuel tanks for refueling other aircraft, as eventually even these aircraft would run out of fuel themselves. At this point, as the forces prepared to converge on the Americans that were now out in the open and trying to conduct last-minute pre-maintenance services and checks, as they had been waiting inside of their buildings and trying to decide what to do, as nobody had come to them. The lieutenant colonel in command over the unit had decided that contact had to be made one way or another with friendly forces, and that his forces should leave the area and try to make contact with the nearest friendly units, which had been assumed that the headquarters of Headquarters Company or the 545th would still somehow be around, although there had been very heavy combat in these areas and artillery shelling had been heard, and it was so close, just mere miles away, only several miles away, that the ground had shaken in this area, which had spurred the lieutenant colonel to get his men moving and get them ready to attempt to make the potentially perilous journey to rendezvous with these other friendly units to figure out what the hell was even going on, as the period of indecision had now passed and it was time to be decisive. And now that he had showed himself, the full weight of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade's Artillery Battalion and its 40 howitzers equipping its firing batteries that comprised it were now, having finished with their fight supporting the units destroying the 545th and the HHC, were fully turning their firepower against the 1st Squadron of the 180th Cav Regiment itself, about to feel the full weight of 40 155 millimeter howitzers raining shells down upon them from the PLZ-05 self-propelled guns. As we prepare to go to the map, combat in the city had been of a vicious, savage nature, with the various cruise missile strikes, loitering munition strikes, air-based strikes, and the mechanized infantry forces, armored forces, also combat engineer forces, even air defense forces, testing out their mettle in battle against the Native American forces, which had fallen in their thousands by this point in the fighting in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, as the 3 different battalions, 2 of which being mechanized infantry, like so, with their VN-20 IFVs and their Type 89A armored personnel carriers, like so, entering the battle space. The VN-20, a very potent infantry fighting vehicle indeed, as was the Type 89A for an armored personnel carrier. It was a sturdy vehicle and was definitely effective in battle when equipped with its W-85 heavy machine gun, and served as a mobile fire support platform for dismounted troops, as they would be dismounted in their different squads and full platoons of them to capture various objectives throughout the field of battle. As these different forces were about to surround and completely aid in the destruction of the now embattled 1st of the 180th Squadron, the armored forces within their Type 96Bs would also be assisting, like they had done, against the forces of the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as they would be supporting the mechanized infantry troops now storming this area of warehouses, which were about to be struck by cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, in addition to heavy artillery strikes impacting the area and reducing much of it to rubble. Going to the map of this particular area, at the very outset and opening of this map, it is already minutes into the battle, as this battle would be another short battle due to the sheer surprise of the attack and the sheer level of firepower brought to bear against this unit, against this battalion, this squadron rather, of Cav troops. As the forces of China's strategic missile forces had been very busy throughout this entire invasion, especially the 612th, 613th, and 616th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, which were from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command of the Strategic Missile Forces. They had been firing, even though they were reinforced with called up reserve battalions in addition to the active battalions, which fired some of the latest and greatest of their missiles. The reserve battalions fired older and highly numerous systems as well, which gave a great boost to the amount of fire they could lay down at a time. And for the first hours of the invasion, most of this fire had been brought to bear against military installations of different types, especially Army and air installations throughout the South Central invasion sector and even beyond with some of the longer range systems. While that had been the case, some missiles had been indeed allocated for the battlefield in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, with tactical ballistic missiles already having struck many key targets, although this was done on an off and on basis as the high demand for this type of support and battle was needed all throughout the South Central invasion sector, which now it had been a relatively good thing for the PLA that they had waited to engage this unit, because at the time of this particular battle, some of these tactical ballistic missile forces had been freed up again from other obligations and could fire in support of this particular battle. And indeed they would, as two DF-21As would land on two different warehouse structures, completely decimating them and everything within a relatively large radius of 800 meters. This was a highly destructive missile and could carry thousands of pounds of HE, not to mention the cruise missiles that were now coming in groups as well. And as mentioned before in previous installments of this series, there were points in time where multiple different systems would hit exactly the same target. That was how destructive and devastating this conflict even was. As the J-11 pair that was supporting the forces in this battle had entered this battle space at this point in time, minutes into the fighting, they, among the first things to occur, had flown over these panicked forces that, as they had lacked complete communications and ISR capabilities and were fully unaware that they were even being surrounded by this point, and had scattered as soon as the first artillery strikes came in, which on this map are literally right here, and with previous others having had reduced these homes to complete ruination and gutted some of these warehouse buildings while destroying others. These had been destroyed already in the first artillery strikes, which had scattered these forces out of their leased, temporarily, bivouac location of warehouse buildings. Now, as these strikes have been coming in, they have been hitting areas that had already been hit once before, but that was because they were all ISR directed as always and were hitting now Bradleys and M113s that were moving through the area, as well as support vehicles as well, which are literally underneath these icons of artillery blasts. Now, as that was going on and these buildings were completely being shredded up by the artillery, and these imminent missile strikes were coming in from these tactical, ballistic, and also cruise missile systems, these YJ-18Cs and Kalibr, Klub-K cruise missiles, artillery was also striking the same area as well. it was definitely overkill in this sense. And CH-901A loitering munitions equipped with heat warheads, which were the best warhead choice being utilized against the vehicles of this particular battalion, as the whole battalion is literally within this 2-mile by 1-mile area. The companies that had moved in consisted of 2 armored companies from the armored battalion out of its 4 companies. There were a company right here, the lead elements of some of the platoons, and a full platoon spread out over this rubble that had used to be a commercial building, as well as another company, including with its headquarters platoon, trailing behind, moving around the north to completely surround this entire area, driving into this parking lot where they intended to stop, with 3 mechanized infantry companies, 1 from the battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade moving into the area, and 2 from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, of which the Armored Battalion, of which these 2 companies are a part, is also a part of. As these forces had fanned out and had faced north, these 2 companies, they had left their headquarters elements behind where it was a bit safer, as the fighting was now becoming intense, even this early on into the fighting, minutes in. As this would be a relatively short battle indeed, some of the squads of these different platoons have been dismounted. This platoon had a squad dismounted to check buildings in the area and secure them, with the squad remounting into their vehicle, with this squad doing the same with this warehouse building here, and this squad doing the same but staying outside their vehicle as they were as fire was being exchanged back and forth between this platoon of armored vehicles of the Americans, led by a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, which managed to get off a fortunate tow missile, which hit and destroyed a Type 89A armor personnel carrier with the VN-20 right next to it, opening fire with its 100mm main gun and 30mm autocannon, which shredded up the lead Bradley and also destroyed the one behind it, with CH-901As also impacting and hitting these vehicles as they had made it up to this point. By that point in time, this squad here that had finished clearing this warehouse building had moved into this building right here, bounding across the street while the vehicles provided cover by firing on these forces. And as they had done this, that the back MRAP had been firing at this building as they started firing out, as the vehicles began to pull out of the area as fire became too intense. They had also assisted in firing around this corner at these vehicles, as shown in even this lead point man of the squad. And they had taken enough fire, so they had gotten out of there. And as they made it to this point, artillery strikes had been called in on them, directed by the quadcopter reconnaissance drones at the squad level. And the precise strikes had decimated this entire platoon of gun trucks. At the opening of this map, these 2 Bradleys and 2 M113 armor personnel carriers had already been completely destroyed by these very artillery strikes right here at the opening of the map, with more inbound just to shred them up even more, which essentially just blasted the carcass vehicles that much in addition to what they had already suffered. As the armored forces had been moving around the area, they were taking fire from some of these Bradleys, firing their 20mm autocannon, but tank shells were quickly return-fired before these Bradleys and M113s with their M250 cals even had much of a chance to do anything, especially the Bradleys, as they were the ones that had the tow missile, which was even capable of doing anything to the tanks, and they were destroyed in short order by direct fire from these Type 96B main battle tanks as they fired into them as they had come around the corner early on and continued their movement. As they fired in passing against other vehicles and ground troops leaving the area, artillery had come in as the missile had struck. This all happening at the same time before the missile came in and finished off the Bradleys on the perimeter and M113s, with the cruise missile strikes, the artillery strikes as shown, and the tank shelling as shown, all of these munitions hitting them all about the same time. As these forces ran out of the area, artillery struck, destroying them with this MRAP as it was being fired at by the tanks. This LMTV truck, this LMTV truck, this one and this one had all been destroyed by tank shell fire as the tanks had continued their movement, and they went over these railroad tracks right here and stopped in this parking lot of this commercial area right here with these warehouse buildings and offices. As that had occurred, this platoon of vehicles from another company of the 1st of the 180th, as it was comprised of 4 total companies, its headquarters in Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, they were destroyed as the tanks had come around the corner by the tank fire. Also, CH-901A loitering munitions coming into the area and hitting them as well, completely decimating them before they even had a chance to respond. Tank shell fire destroyed this vehicle along with the impact of the tactical ballistic and cruise missiles into the area and artillery strikes as well. As, again, by the time the vehicles were here, this missile was just coming in as the fire began against all of these vehicles. The tanks firing as they were rolling through, firing, and the missile hit, and the artillery hit, and the cruise missiles came in and hit, as shown. Now, in the south, dismounted squads at the opening of this map were already moving into the area, with one squad going into this building right here to clear it before going into this building, while this squad was moving up the street, hugging the buildings and the fences right here of this property, firing at and getting return fire from these Cav Scout dismounts who managed to KIA a few PLA troops. And this CH-901A at the opening of the map had destroyed this LMTV truck. With this squad moving up as well, these squads were supporting one another, both firing at these forces here. As this vehicle was moving here, it was hit by a CH-901A, as well as fire from around the corner from this Type 89A that was firing at all these vehicles with its heavy machine gun. And also the vehicles here were laying down fire between the troops at these forces, which completely helped to annihilate them quickly. Although they got in a few good shots and managed to wipe out a few PLA troops in the short time they had to live, they were all eventually wiped out as this truck had hurriedly sped off down and across the tracks, this LMTV right here, and made it here while taking fire from these forces, from the vehicle-based fire coming down, and more. And as they made it around this corner, they had finally been destroyed as this mechanized infantry company was moving up through the area. CH-901As were coming down and hitting these vehicles as the VN-20 had fired as it scanned its sector, fired and destroyed this MRAP with its 100mm main gun, fired at this Bradley, destroying it as a CH-901A came in and hit the vehicles behind it, along with this one doing the same, as it was a loitering munition, could swing around and hit it and destroy it, hence the encapsulated green arrow in red, this entire platoon being decimated, with these LMTV trucks being heavily engaged and wiped out, with these J-11 fighters flying in and dropping their payload, 2 laser-guided 500-pound munitions on this force right here. That is why these 2 vehicles have encapsulated arrows in red. They are completely destroyed, these 2 vehicles, by these laser-guided munitions that have been dropped by this J-11 at the opening of this map. And as this one flies into this area, it too drops its laser-guided payload and destroys this M113 and this LMTV right here, destroying them. As these support vehicles, 2 LMTVs, these trucks, and a fuel truck and an M88 armored recovery vehicle move through the area, they're also hit by loitering munitions and also fire coming from around the corner from this heavy machine gun mounted on top of this Type 89A, which just shreds up these LMTVs easily, as well as a fuel truck, and hits into this M88 armored recovery vehicle as well. As the combat was short-lived, it was relatively intense and savage, as the lead Bradley here, again, did manage to wipe out a Type 89A with its Bradley-based tow missile pod firing at this Type 89A, destroying it and KIAing or wiping out its entire crew. Although by the time that the battle was nearing its conclusion, it had only lasted really about 20 minutes, as multiple combat occurrences had been going on since the opening of this map, and being that this map takes place minutes into it, approximately 10 minutes, this fight was over in under 25 minutes, mostly as these forces had maneuvered into place crossing the street as they went out of this entryway gate area that had been smashed by vehicles breaking through, and they had seized control of the bridge, preventing any escape from any potential surviving forces such as these dismounts, and none of the vehicles survived as they were all hit by loitering munitions, airstrikes, tank shells, infantry fighting vehicle fire, and heavy machine gun fire, and artillery. And many more were destroyed completely by the cruise missile strikes and tactical ballistic missile strikes that completely cratered a massive area, that also took down platoons worth of vehicles that were stuck in the area that didn't even make it out in time, as they were lined up for inspection by the time PLA troops had rolled into the area, leaving them completely and utterly annihilated, with very few even making it out of the warehouse vicinity in their bid to try to escape the area. As initially, again, they had wanted to make contact with other friendly forces, but they were simply unable to. They had been rapidly surrounded by the time they had emerged, and also hit by all of these missiles and artillery, the artillery fire coming from the PLZ-05 howitzers, self-propelled howitzers of the Artillery Battalion of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, and the cruise missiles coming from the container-based YJ-18C cruise missiles and Kalibr Klub-K container-based cruise missiles, and the tactical ballistic missile strikes, of course, coming from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, itself a Trojan unit in eastern Texas, with its missiles easily able to hit Oklahoma City, as it was well within range of its striking capabilities. As the forces had laid down heavy firepower and lost 2 troops in a firefight that broke out near the railroad tracks between this element trying to run this way while others had tried to make for the bridge, all of them were eventually cut down, but not before they managed to wipe out 2 troops from the squad, while another whole squad, including driver and gunner, were wiped out by a tow missile here. The PLA suffered more casualties in this particular instance than they had at many other battles throughout the Oklahoma City battle as a whole, as they had lost 14 troops KIA and they had lost several WIAs. The reason why they had lost more KIAs and WIAs is because the tow missile wiped out this vehicle and everybody inside of it in one swift stroke, whereas the exchange of fire between these mutually supporting squads moving up together had wiped these guys out with heavy vehicle-based fire, but some of these guys got in some good shots as they were equipped with their M249 squad automatic weapons, or SAW light machine guns. They had barrel-fired 40mm grenades, and they also had hand grenades and there were a few with 240 Bravos, but most of these men didn't even get a chance to fire their weapons because the sheer weight of firepower was far too powerful, from tank shells like frag T shells that blew infantry to pieces. Also, the CH-901A loitering munitions, heavy machine gun fire from the mechanized infantry vehicles, such as the Type 89As, and the devastating VN-20 infantry fighting vehicles with their 100mm main gun shells, their 30mm autocannon ammunition, and 7.62 by 54mm turret-based coaxial machine guns. The tanks alone were devastating enough on their own, as the frag T shells, again, would annihilate clusters of infantry, and the heat shells they could fire, which were just standard heat ammunition, would devastate a Bradley or any other well-armored vehicle, minus maybe an Abrams, which they would use a Sabo round against, or a DU round, which would destroy it with ease, or their anti-tank guided missile, which could be fired from the 125mm gun itself, as its breech and bore were designed with the ability to handle such in mind. As you can see, the warehouse building had completely caught fire, with whatever was inside of it burning after being struck by artillery missiles, tank shells, and the heavy volume of small arms fire being exchanged. Quadcopter recon drone asset, and more. As this was an under 25-minute battle and began at approximately 5:30 a.m., and the battle, as shown on this segment of the larger battle, began 10 minutes in, then that meant that this particular portion of the battle itself was just under 15 minutes in duration. From the time the air power showed up, CH-901A loitering munitions showed up that were fired by the headquarters battalion of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, and the surrounding units began to close in, along with the cruise missile strikes and tactical ballistic missile strikes. This battle was over. After this battalion had been completely and totally wiped out in the field, the last major fighting occurring within this battle, as this battle was by this point wrapping up as well with the remains of the 2nd of the 134th, was the actions taking place in the downtown area, as this battle in the western pocket and this in the eastern pocket would be the last major combat operations in the entire battle of the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma area, and these would go on for quite some time, as these forces had their proverbial backs pressed to one another, similar to what had occurred in the west of the metro area, as the last major highway area that was being contested had now been taken. As all the highways in this area were now firmly under PLA control, as the ring around these forces extended within these highways. PLA was in full control of all the highways by this point in the battle. The fighting in downtown is next.